Hey guys, it's Mr. Bosher, and today we are going to talk about something called conditional statements. Alright, these are also referred to as if then statements. Okay, and we'll get into why they are called that in a second. But let's just first start off with, okay, well, why do I need conditional statements? Well, conditional statements, or these if-then statements, are very good when we notice patterns and we want to sort of explain the pattern that we're seeing for someone else, right? And we came up with a word for this in our last video lesson of when we notice a pattern, but we don't really know if it works all the time. And that word was a conjecture, okay? So one of the things that we're going to do a lot this year in geometry is we're going to make conjectures. We're going to notice a pattern, and then we're going to try to say it works all the time, even though if we're not 100% sure, right? And later in the year, we'll try to prove those things so we can get to theorems, but we're not quite there yet, right? Our goal right now is to make conjectures. But in order to make conjectures, we have to know how to write them, okay? And that's where this if-then statement is going to come into play. So let me give you an example of a conditional statement or an if-then statement. So let's say something like, if it is Wednesday, then Mr. Bosher will go to Taco Bell. Okay, that's a conditional statement. Maybe you have noticed that every single Wednesday I go to Taco Bell. That may or may not be true, but it doesn't really matter for my example, okay? All we care about right now is that there is an if and there is a then, okay? So what do each of these mean? Well, the if is what we call the hypothesis or the condition, okay? So if, let me write that a little bit nicer. If is the hypothesis or the condition. Basically, the thing that has to happen before we even care about the rest of the problem. Because if it's not Wednesday, well, then the second part of the statement never happens, right? Because the if didn't happen. So that's what the if stands for. It says basically what has to happen before I care about the second half of the statement. And this is usually given a variable, because as you're going to see, we're going to mess with these statements a little bit and move some pieces around. And so instead of having to write this whole statement again and again and again, we use variables to sort of speed up the process, okay? So the if, or the condition, is usually given the variable p, okay? The then is usually called the conclusion, right? Or you can think of this as the result. Basically, if the condition happens, what happens as a result? Or what is the conclusion to that if, right? That condition. So in this case, if it is Wednesday, you could say, well, the result is Mr. Bosher is going to end up at Taco Bell at some point, right? With our if-then statement. Again, is it true or not? That's a question for another day. But right now, that's what our conjecture says, our conditional statement says. The variable that we usually use for the then or the result is going to be the letter Q. All right? So if I put this all together, an if-then statement, so I could say the original if-then statement, we can also write as, so I'm going to say is equal to saying, if P, then Q. Okay? So you might be saying, okay, whoa, why are there variables, right? Like, what is the P and the Q here for? I don't get it. Basically, if I don't want to write out my statement again, so I don't want to write out if it is Wednesday, then Mr. Bosher will go to Taco Bell. Every single time I'm writing the conditional statement, I can just say, hey, I named them P and Q earlier, so you know that this means if it is Wednesday, and you know that this means then Mr. Bosher goes to Taco Bell. It's way faster to write P arrow Q than it is to write a whole sentence, okay? That's all. Now, we're going to see, okay, why do we use variables then to speed up the process? Like, why would I have to write it multiple times? Well, sometimes when we make conjectures, we want to play around with the order that we say things, right? And see if they still work or if they break in all those sorts of things. Because you'll be surprised at how helpful that can be in the math world, okay? So our original statement said, if it is Wednesday, then Mr. Bosher will go to Taco Bell, right? So this is my P, if it is Wednesday, and this is my Q. I will go to Taco Bell. The next thing we want to look at, though, is called a converse. Okay, so how is that going to change what we just wrote? So a converse says this. What if we say if Q, then P? Okay? So instead of saying if P then Q, we're saying if Q then P. Well, what was Q again? Well, that was my original then statement. So Mr. Bosher will go to Taco Bell. So we're going to start off this statement. The converse of the statement is going to be if Mr. Bosher goes to Taco Bell, then I have to say P. What was my original P? It is Wednesday, right? So I'm going to say then it is Wednesday. And that would be the converse of our original conditional statement, okay? And we could sit here and think about, well, are these two the same thing, right? My original statement says if it's Wednesday, then I will go to Taco Bell. The converse of the statement says, well, flip those around. If I go to Taco Bell, then it must be Wednesday. Do you think those two things have to be true? Not really. Does the first statement say that I'm not allowed to go to Taco Bell on a Friday? No, right? So if I'm allowed to go to Taco Bell on any day, then this second statement is not the same, right? If I go to Taco Bell, that does not automatically mean it's Wednesday, right? Just it could be Wednesday. It doesn't have to be. So we already noticed that our original statement and the converse statement are not true, okay? But we'll learn that later on that for some statements, they will stay true at the same time, which is great for us, okay? Because we can prove a theorem with multiple wordings, right? Which is a lot stronger than just with one specific way to say it, okay? But for you today, I just need you to understand, like, hey, if I said write the converse, you know that it just means this right here, right? Flip the original statement around, okay? Don't worry, I'm going to do a second example of this since I'm kind of like rambling. So hopefully by the end you'll see, okay, how do I move it around? That's your goal today, all right? So that's converse. You just flip them. The next one is inverse. Okay, so let's see. Inverse has this formula. It says squiggly line P goes to squiggly line Q. Alright, so what is the squiggly line? Okay, like we gotta figure this out. The squiggly line, I'll put a little note over here, means negation. Okay? Basically, it just means no, or the opposite. Okay, so I basically take what I said originally and I say the exact opposite. So if I look at negation P, well, what was original P? It was if it is Wednesday. Okay? So how do I negate that? I will just say if it is not Wednesday. and that would be the negation. Okay? Same thing for Q. How do I negate Q, or the squiggly line Q? I would say, then Mr. Bosher will not go to Taco Bell. Basically, you're just going to add in the word not. You're doing the opposite of what you originally said. Okay? So let's try it. Original P said, if it is Wednesday, but I want the negation or like the opposite of that. So I'm going to say, if it is not Wednesday, and then Mr. Bosher will not go to Taco Bell. You see how we just took the original statement and added the nots, right? That's what the negation does. And that's all you have to do for an inverse. And again, just sort of like an extra thing that you could think about is, well, does the inverse match the original, right? Because our next lesson, video lesson after this is going to be talking about like, okay, well, you know, are these things true? And if I swap them to converse and inverse and all that, do they stay true? Okay, so you can already start thinking about that. Is the inverse saying the same thing as the original, right? Is the converse saying the same thing as the inverse? Just a little extra exercise. If you're already understanding how to swap the pieces and how to rewrite them, it's just a little extra thing that you can think about, okay? If you can notice any patterns there. But all right, that's the main idea for inverse. We have one more, okay? We have one more way to rewrite our conditional statements. And that is going to be the contrapositive. I know, it's a long name. But the good part about it is the most complicated name has the most complicated formula. So at least it's easy to remember that, right? So most complicated name, most complicated formula. So what does that formula look like? Well, it does both the inverse and the converse. So if we go back and we think, what did the converse do? Well, it swapped P and Q, right? They swapped places. Then what did the inverse do? It put the negations on everything. So the contrapositive says, I want to do all of that. So first I'm going to swap P and Q. So here's Q. And it's going to go to P. And then I also want to negate them. So that's the contrapositive. Okay? So let's go ahead and write that. What is the negation of Q? Well, we're going to say if Mr. Bosher we'll say does not, right, there's the not, go to Taco Bell, then it is not Wednesday. Let me write that a little bit nicer. Not Wednesday. And there's my not there. Okay? And that's a contrapositive. Okay, all I want you to do is be able to say, hey, if I give you an original statement, right, an original if-then statement at the beginning, can you write me the converse? You just swap them. The inverse, you just do the negation. And the contrapositive, you swap them and do the negation. Okay? That's all I need you to do. Now, I know that I rambled and I know I threw a lot at you because I was kind of getting ahead of myself with what we're going to do in the next lesson. But I'm going to do another example real quick and kind of just say, like, hey, we're only focusing on can we rewrite them. All right? And then at the end, I'm going to tell you about, like, ways to sort of remember, like, each form, right? Like, how do I know what the inverse formula is again and what the converse is and all of that? Okay? So let's try another one. Now that we've kind of seen what we're doing and what the goal is, let's just put one together and see if you can stay with me and it makes sense. So we need a new... Am I out of space? Alright. Before I start them, let's just kind of start over then. So we don't run out of space while we do this. Okay, I need a new if-then statement. So I'm going to say... Let's see. My original statement, remember, is going to be P if P, then Q, right? This is the original. And I'm going to say that that is going to say if Mr. Bosher sees a dog, then he will pet it. That's my if then. And this one might be true, like 100%, just by the way. Okay? So, if Mr. Bosher sees a dog, then he will pet it. That's our original if-then statement, our original conditional statement. Now, I want to do the converse. Okay? So, let's write that. Converse, remember, is that we're just going to swap the if and the then, right? My P and Q. So, instead of starting with P, we're going to start with Q. And then we're going to end with P. Okay? So how does that change the statement? Let's find out. Well, our original Q said he will pet it, right? So we're going to say Mr. Bosher will pet it. So we need to say if Mr. Bosher pets a dog, then, well, what was my original P? That means that I saw a dog. Okay, so then we can just say he saw it. Notice that sometimes based on like the wording or like your if then statement, you're allowed to sort of change them so that they make more sense in English. Because if I just said if Mr. Bosher pets it, that doesn't really make sense, right? Because it's at the beginning. So I'm allowed to change them a little bit as long as the general idea is the same. So I said if Mr. Bosher pets a dog, then he saw it. Because the main points of P was C, and the main point of the Q, the original Q, was pet, right? So as long as I keep that going in the next one, then that's the basic idea. So you don't have to use the exact wording. You can change the wording a little bit if you were wondering about that. Okay, but that would be our converse, right? I need to say the pet part first, and then the fact that I saw it second. Now, we move on to the inverse. This is going to be my first tip for you. Remember from algebra that inverse kind of means opposite, right? So I want to do the inverse. Remember that that basically means opposite. So that should be a hint to you like, hey, I'm going to do the opposite of my original statement, which means that we're going to do the negation symbols, right? Remember the negation, the little squiggly line, basically mean the opposite of what you did before. So inverse wants you to add those in. Okay, that can be how you remember. So inverse means opposite. So I'm going to do the opposite of what I said the first time. Right? I got to add the negations to get the opposites. All right, so negation P, then negation Q. So what was P, right? And originally it was if Mr. Bosher sees a dog. So how am I going to do the opposite of that? Well, I'm just going to say if I do not see a dog, right? We're just going to add the nots in. So if Mr. Bosher does not see a dog, then, well, what was my original Q? Then he will pet it. So again, how do I make that the opposite? Then he will not pet it. So then he will not pet it. And there you go. There's your inverse statement. Simple as that. And now we have the last one, the complicated name, contrapositive. Alright, I already told you. How do you remember contrapositive? Well, it's the most complicated name, so it's got the most complicated equation, right, or formula. And that formula is not that bad either, because it's basically just saying, hey, do the two you just did, but put together, right? Do converse and inverse together. So I need to swap P and Q, So I'm going to start with Q and then go to P. And I want to negate both of these as well. Right? I'm doing everything at once. All the changes I can do at once. Right? Most complicated word goes with the most complicated formula. So let's see. Our original Q was that I will pet it. Right? But now I need to negate that. So I'm going to say I will not pet it. So we're going to say if Mr. Bosher let's write that nicer, does not pet, let's just say a dog, then, well, what was the original P? The original P was that I saw the dog. So if I want the negation of that, or the opposite, then I'm going to say I did not see the dog. So I go over here, say then, he did not see a dog. All right, and there's my contrapositive. I swapped my original statement, and I had to add the nots in. And that's basically it. Okay? So your ALEKS assignment will give you an original statement, right? Your original conditional statement. And then we'll say, hey, what's the converse? And you just got to know that just means you swap them. Then it'll say, what's the inverse? Well, you take your original statement and you add the nots in. And then it'll say, what's the contrapositive? Well, now I have to swap them and add the negations in. And you're just going to get used to that. Okay? There's a lot more we can do with these statements, and I might have mentioned them, and that might have made it confusing. I know I might have rambled. I'm sorry. But right now we just want to get used to, if I say, hey, what's the converse? You can give me the converse. And like, what's the inverse? You can give me the inverse. Because we're going to ask more questions about that as we get later on in this week. Okay? So, if you have any questions, let me know. But yeah, other than that, good luck and have a great day.